My wife came home from work with kiss marks on her neck and the strong perfume of another man permeating her clothes. I stared at it, tried to find a rational explanation, but the only thing that came to mind was the brutal, crushing possibility of betrayal. The mind of a man in love always wants to believe the comforting lie rather than the devastating truth, but there was something there, something that wouldn't be erased with a cheap excuse. And so, I asked the question, directly, bluntly, with no room for maneuver. Why those kiss marks? And who owns that men's perfume? Are you cheating on me? Her silence was the first response. A drawn-out silence, filled with a weight that she tried to hold back, but which soon collapsed when her eyes wavered. And then, the lie came. Weak, poorly constructed, said with the hesitation of someone who has already been unmasked before even opening their mouth. I don't know what you're talking about. This must be a mistake. A mistake. Like I'm an idiot. As if I didn't know the smell of another man in my house, at my wedding. As if I didn't recognize a kiss that wasn't mine. Betrayal, when discovered, does not come alone. She brings with her a whirlwind of violent emotions. First, denial. The desire to believe that it was all a misunderstanding. But then comes the anger. A dull, corrosive anger that squeezes your chest like an invisible fist. My mind screamed, relived moments, scenes that seemed insignificant before, but now took on a new meaning. The messages she started hiding, the increasingly irregular hours, the cell phone that never left her pocket. Small signs that were previously ignored out of love were now proof. Proof that I was deceived, that I was made a fool of. And worse, while I was dedicating myself, while I was trying to make this marriage work, she was in other arms, in another smell, in another body. I didn't confront it right away. I just watched. I watched her pathetic attempt to appear offended, to turn the tables, to make me doubt what my own eyes were seeing. I watched her nervousness when I tried to hug her, when I tried to smell her more closely. She pulled away, as if my skin burned hers. And in that moment, I knew. I knew it wasn't an assumption, it wasn't paranoia. I had a woman who no longer belonged to me. A woman who, in some way, had already left me, but remained by my side out of convenience, out of fear, or perhaps out of guilt. The divorce was announced that same night. No shouting, no fighting. Only with the relentless certainty that there was nothing left to save. She tried to argue, she tried to use excuses, she even tried to blame me. But I no longer listened. I no longer felt anything but emptiness. An open abyss between the two of us, an abyss that could not be closed. The love I felt was still there, but now it was a sick, contaminated, rotten love. And so, I left her. I left her behind, along with all the broken promises and sleepless nights. But betrayal has a price. There always is. She doesn't just destroy a marriage, she destroys the cheater. Because the euphoria of the forbidden has an expiration date. Because what was built on lies does not stand the test of time. As I started my life over, as I allowed myself to find a new path, it sank. Not right away. Not as quickly as I would like. But time is cruel to those who hurt those who love them. And when he finally realized what he had done, when he finally understood that he had thrown away true love for a fleeting illusion, it was too late. But fate has unexpected ways of giving back everything we take from others. And when the truth finally came out, when the consequences of the betrayal came upon her like an inevitable punishment, the world she had built fell apart. The man she threw everything away for discarded her without hesitation. She lost her reputation, she lost her certainties, she even lost the admiration of those who once loved her. And when he tried to return, when he tried to find salvation in the past for the present that had become a nightmare, all he found was emptiness. Fate is cruel to those who play with other people's feelings. And in the end, she realized that the biggest mistake of her life was not cheating on me, but believing that she could get away with it. Time always demands, always gives back, and this time, it was just beginning. Welcome to the channel where the truth about cheating is exposed bluntly. Here, we never support infidelity, on the contrary, our fictional stories show the devastating impact that betrayal has on people's lives. Every lie has a price, every wrong choice has consequences, and the pain of those who are betrayed never goes unpunished. Get ready for an intense story, full of twists and deep emotions. A story that will move you and remind you that those who play with love, sooner or later, pay the price. Now, take a deep breath, because what comes next is going to shock you. Richard has never been a man of great exaggerations. His life always followed a peaceful rhythm, guided by hard work, loyalty and the belief that true love was something built day after day. When he met Emily, more than 10 years ago, he knew from the first moment that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. She had a special sparkle in her eyes, a sweet way of speaking and a presence that seemed to light up any room she was in. The two quickly fell in love, building a solid relationship together, one that seemed made to last forever. The marriage came naturally, without rushing, without doubts, just with the certainty that they were exactly where they should be. They settled in a beautiful house on the outskirts of the city, a spacious, comfortable place, where they imagined they would form a family and live the best years of their lives. Richard was always a present husband. She worked hard, but never failed to make time for Emily. He liked to prepare breakfast on the weekends, to surprise her with small displays of affection and to remember details that many men overlooked. He was the kind of person who cared, who made a point of showing love not just with words, but with actions. Emily, on the other hand, has always had a different energy. She was more expansive, more sociable, she loved being surrounded by people, she liked the hustle and bustle of the city, the new things in the world. He had a restless spirit, but he always made Richard believe that this didn't mean dissatisfaction, just a more agitated personality. She liked to tell stories, laugh out loud, talk about her dreams and how she wanted to achieve something great in life. He admired her for that. From the beginning of their marriage, he knew that she was not the type to be content with a monotonous routine, and that is why he strived to make life with her something special. Time, however, has a cruel way of wearing down even the strongest structures. The years passed, and the marriage, once full of passion and spontaneity, was swallowed up by the predictability of adult life. Richard was still in love, but he noticed that Emily no longer seemed so present. The sparkle in her eyes diminished, conversations became shorter, kisses became more hurried. Romantic dinners became sporadic events, nights of affection became rare, and little by little, the connection that once seemed unshakable began to become fragile. He tried to rekindle the flame, but something in him told him it wasn't enough. Emily, in turn, immersed herself more and more in her work. Her role at a marketing company demanded more and more from her, and at the same time, gave her a sense of purpose that she somehow felt she was missing at home. The corporate environment was dynamic, full of challenges, ambitious people, exciting conversations about goals, new projects, growth. It was a world in which she felt alive. Richard, on the other hand, saw his wife's new rhythm as something distant, like a universe that didn't belong to him. He wasn't part of that frenetic world, that vibrant energy that seemed to motivate her. But he never complained. He never stopped Emily from following her dreams. On the contrary, he supported her, as he always did. The changes were gradual. Emily started arriving later, having unexpected meetings, getting lost in long conversations on the phone that ended with a discreet smile on her face. Little details that Richard noticed, but never dared to question. He didn't want to seem like a controlling husband, he didn't want to be the one who suffocates, who distrusts, who turns the marriage into a prison. But something inside him bothered him. A primal instinct, a strange feeling that, even though everything seemed normal on the surface, something was different. He ignored it, tried to stifle the bad thoughts, convincing himself that the love they had was stronger than anything. The weekends began to be filled with events at Emily's company, with meetings with coworkers he had never really met. Her boss's name began to appear frequently in conversations, always accompanied by praise, stories that demonstrated his intelligence, his charisma, his impeccable leadership. Richard listened, smiled, tried to participate, but felt that, somehow, he was increasingly distant from his wife's life. He wondered if it was just in his head, if it was just the effect of time, routine, responsibilities that burden any couple. There was one night in particular that stood out in Richard's mind. An ordinary day, nothing out of the ordinary. Emily left early, said she had dinner with coworkers and would be back late. He, as always, did not object. He just wanted her to enjoy it. He spent the night alone, preparing a simple dinner, watching a movie, waiting for her. When Emily arrived, it was already past midnight. She was radiant, with a sparkle in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. His skin exuded a different perfume, a sophisticated, masculine aroma. He moved closer to kiss her, but she turned her face away with a hurried smile, claiming to be tired. Richard stood there, watching her climb the stairs. Something inside him stirred, a silent restlessness that he tried to ignore. He took a glass of wine, went to the balcony, sat down and looked at the dark sky. He tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that it was all just paranoia. But deep down, he knew. I knew there was something wrong. And once that feeling settles inside a man, it doesn't go away. It just grows, silent and relentless. Over the next few days, he noticed that his wife was more distracted, as if her mind was always somewhere else. Her touch became mechanical, her kisses cold. She smiled, but it was an automatic, lifeless smile. Richard tried to get her back, tried to propose a trip, a special dinner, anything that could rekindle what they seemed to be missing. But Emily refused with vague excuses. She said that the work was demanding, that she was exhausted, that she needed space. It was then that Richard realized that perhaps he had already lost something he didn't even know was at stake. He just didn't know what was yet to come. The days passed, and Richard began to notice that something was changing before his eyes, but he didn't want to believe it. Love has this cruel ability to make us ignore the obvious, it makes us look for excuses for what cannot be justified. He saw Emily increasingly distant, immersed in her work, in her excuses, in a world that no longer included him. What was once a shared home began to feel like a space shared between two strangers. He tried not to suffocate her, he tried to respect her time, believing that it was all just a phase, that their marriage was strong enough to withstand the natural turmoil of life. But the doubts, even if ignored, grow silently, and the discomfort became a weight that he carried without being able to share with anyone. Nights that were once filled with conversations about the day, laughter, plans for the future, were replaced by uncomfortable silences and vague answers. Emily went out more and more, always citing work commitments, meetings that went on overtime, corporate meetings that became more frequent. Richard tried to participate in that world of hers, asked if he could accompany her to one of the events, but received a forced smile and a quick excuse about how boring dinners and endless discussions about marketing and numbers would be. He accepted, as he always did, trying to be the understanding husband who never invaded his wife's space. But that night, as Emily got ready in front of the mirror, choosing a dress he hadn't seen in months, putting on a perfume he never used, Richard felt something inside him break. He didn't say anything. Just watched. He observed the way she looked at herself in the mirror, how she fixed her hair with a care she no longer had when she was with him, how the anxiety in her eyes was not one of tiredness, but of expectation. She was radiant, and that scared him. He didn't say he would stay up and wait. He just kissed her cheek and watched her walk out the door, as the echo of high heels disappeared in the hallway. He was left alone, sitting on the sofa, holding a glass of whiskey that he didn't even notice when it was filled. The hours passed slowly, dragging, and, without realizing it, he picked up his cell phone and started looking at the clock. Midnight. 1 o'clock in the morning. No messages, no calls. He tried to push away the thoughts that were pounding in his mind, he tried to trust his wife. But trust is a thin thread, and when it starts to fray, it can hardly be repaired. It was that morning that something changed. Emily arrived, taking off her shoes at the door as if to avoid any noise. The smell of men's perfume mixed with hers filled the air, and Richard felt a pang in his chest, as if every doubt turned into sharp certainties. He didn't say anything. He just watched as she smiled differently, while avoiding eye contact and saying that she was tired, that she wanted to take a shower and sleep. He just mumbled, "Good night," and waited. He waited until he heard her get into the shower, waited until the noise of the water covered any sound he might make. And then, something I had never done before. He took her bag, opened it slowly, feeling his heart speed up. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, perhaps a clue, an answer that could ease his anguish or confirm it once and for all. Inside the bag, she found a lipstick that wasn't hers, a note from an expensive restaurant and a small bottle of men's perfume. His chest tightened, his mind whirled in a whirlwind of thoughts. It wasn't just a doubt now. There was something concrete, something that couldn't be explained with yet another convenient excuse. He put everything back, closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. When Emily came out of the shower, her hair still damp and wearing her cotton nightgown, he watched her without saying anything. There was a gulf between them that only one of them seemed not to notice. The next day, something in him changed. Richard was no longer the man who accepted vague answers and empty promises. He started paying attention, started noticing every little detail, every message read and unanswered in front of him, every excuse that came up when he tried to program something together. He noticed that Emily smiled more on her phone than when she was with him, that her mind wandered to places he didn't know, that her perfume always had a hint of something that didn't belong to him. But he needed more. He needed the truth, even if it was cruel, even if it ripped apart every piece of what he once believed to be unshakable. It was then that he decided to follow Emily. Not out of unhealthy jealousy, not out of obsession, but because I needed to know. He needed to face the reality he tried so hard to ignore. He chose a night when she said she had an important meeting, a dinner that couldn't be avoided. He waited for her to leave, gave it a few minutes and got in the car. He followed her from afar, feeling his heart race at every closed traffic light, at every curve. She drove to a fancy restaurant, a place she never suggested going together. She got out of the car, straightened her dress, smiled at someone who was already waiting for her at the door. It was at that moment that Richard felt his world fall apart. The man waiting for her was none other than the boss she praised so much, the one whose name appeared in casual conversations as a simple superior, someone who inspired her. But there, at that moment, there was no formality, there was no professional respect. There was intimacy, there was complicity, there was something he had never seen when Emily looked at him. They entered together, sat at a private table, and as the night progressed, Richard saw everything he needed to see. The looks, the hands that discreetly touched each other on the table, the easy laugh, the sparkle in the eyes that he no longer recognized. He stood there, outside, watching the woman he loved be someone else, one he didn't know. Time seemed to have slowed down, every detail burned within him. When Emily smiled and held her boss's hand, as if it were the most natural gesture in the world, Richard knew. He knew that everything he built, everything he fought for, had been destroyed without him even realizing it. Betrayal, when revealed, does not come with screams or explosions. It comes in the cutting silence of certainty, in the pain that squeezes the chest like a dry blow. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that moment sinking in. And then, I knew that nothing would be the same again. Richard spent the next few days in a daze, his mind wavering between anger, disbelief, and the crushing pain that consumed every part of his being. He tried to continue his routine, tried to act like he didn't know, but it was impossible. Every time he saw Emily, every time he heard her voice, he felt as if he were facing a stranger, someone who had lied to him so naturally that it made him question whether, at some point, he had really met her. He wanted to confront her, wanted her to look him in the eye and tell the truth, but he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Emily was skilled at manipulating words, at distorting facts, at making things seem less serious than they really were. That night, he waited for her in the living room, sitting silently, his fingers drumming on the glass table. The clock was almost midnight when she entered, quickly turning off her cell phone before even looking at it. Richard realized this and felt the bitter taste of confirmation. When she noticed his serious expression, she hesitated for a second, but then forced a smile and walked towards him as if nothing was out of the ordinary. He said that the dinner lasted longer than he expected, that they were discussing a new project and that he barely saw the time pass. Richard just watched her, the silence between them making the air heavy, suffocating. He waited for her to finish her excuse before slowly standing up and facing her. "I know. That's all I said, but the impact was immediate." Emily blinked a few times, the color draining from her face as her posture subtly changed, as if trying to understand exactly what he meant. "You know what?" He didn't look away. "I know everything." For a moment, she stood still, and then she let out a nervous laugh, crossing her arms as if trying to protect herself. "Richard, what are you talking about? You've been acting strange for days, don't lie." Her voice was low, but carried with a weight that made her silent. "I saw you. I followed you that night. I saw you with him. I saw everything." The silence that followed was piercing. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. His face contorted into something between guilt and despair, as if he was about to deny it but realized it was futile. She looked away, ran her hands through her hair and exhaled deeply before looking at him again. "Richard, he raised his hand, stopping whatever excuse she was about to make. "I didn't want to hear it. It didn't need to." "How long?" She hesitated. "How long, Emily?" "A few months." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the answer. Part of him wanted to scream, wanted to tear down everything around him, wanted her to feel even a fragment of the pain that shot through him. But he forced himself to remain firm. "And you were going to tell me when?" She shook her head, her voice coming out shaky. "I don't know. I didn't mean to hurt you, Richard. I swear it wasn't planned. I don't know what happened, you know exactly what happened." He cut her off, his voice sharp. "You made a choice. You chose to lie, you chose to betray me, you chose to destroy what we built." Emily swallowed hard, tears beginning to pool in her eyes. "I lost myself. I felt suffocated, I felt like something in me was gone, and somehow he made me feel alive again. But I never wanted to hurt you." Richard laughed, a humorless sound, full of bitterness. "And you think that comforts me? That it somehow takes away from what you did?" She opened her mouth to respond, but he was no longer listening. His heart beat in his chest like a drum, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. All he wanted was for that conversation to end, for this woman in front of him, the one who was no longer his Emily, to disappear from his life. And then, her phone vibrated. His eyes dropped to the device, still in her hand. She froze. "Who is it?" "Richard, please." He walked forward and grabbed the cell phone before she could react. Unlocked. Open messages. And there it was, the final test. The boss's name, the short and casual message. "Did you get there okay? Today was amazing. I can't wait for tomorrow." Richard felt like he was running out of air. He looked up at Emily, and there, in that moment, there was nothing else. Neither love, nor sadness, nor hope. Just a vacuum. "I want a divorce." Emily covered her mouth with her hand, the sound of a choked sob echoing through the room. But he had already made his decision. He left, leaving her alone with her tears, her empty apologies, and the weight of the choices she made. But destiny still had something in store for her. Because betrayal never comes without consequences. And Emily would soon discover that she had lost much more than a faithful husband. She had lost everything. Richard left the house that night without looking back. His chest burned, his hands shook, but he knew that if he stayed there for a few more minutes, he might say or do something he would regret. The cold early morning air bit into his skin as he walked aimlessly, with only the crushing weight of betrayal burning inside him. He needed space, he needed to get out of the environment where every piece of furniture, every smell, every shadow reminded him and Emily together. But now, that together no longer existed. Hours passed until he stopped in front of a hotel, a simple, discreet place. I didn't want to call friends, I didn't want to talk, I didn't want to listen to advice. I just wanted to step away and let time drag that weight until I could breathe again. In the cramped and characterless room, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring into space. His cell phone vibrated non-stop in his pocket. He knew who it was, but he didn't have the strength to look. I didn't want to read messages asking for forgiveness, I didn't want to hear lame excuses, I didn't want anything more from her. Emily was at home, maybe sitting on the couch where they had so often snuggled together, maybe crying, maybe wondering if he would come back. But he knew there was no going back. Not this time. Not after all. The next morning, he returned home just to pick up some clothes and essential belongings. The silence in the room was heavy. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and puffy, holding a cup of coffee that she didn't even seem to notice was getting cold in her hands. When he saw Richard enter, he stood up suddenly, hesitantly, as if he didn't know whether to get closer or stay away. Richard. Not now, he cut off, walking straight to the bedroom. She followed him but kept a careful distance, watching as he picked up a suitcase and began to stuff some clothes into it without any concern for organization. You don't have to go. We can work this out. His voice was a brittle thread of desperation, but he didn't even stop to look at her. Solve what, Emily? He threw a shirt into his suitcase and finally looked up at her. Address the fact that you lied. That you cheated on me for months. That you looked into my eyes so many times and pretended nothing was happening. She bit her bottom lip, her face contorting between guilt and helplessness. I know I messed up, but I still love you, Richard. He let out a humorless laugh. Love? You call that love? He closed the suitcase with a sudden movement and walked past her, returning to the living room. If you really loved me, none of this would have happened. Please, she reached out, touching his arm, but he pulled away as if her touch burned him. Don't do this, he said, his voice deep, thick with weariness. Don't try to hold me back now. You made your choice, and now you need to deal with the consequences. Emily stood still, tears streaming down her face, but Richard no longer felt sorry. I couldn't feel it. He just grabbed his keys and walked to the door. I'm going to talk to a lawyer. I want to resolve the divorce as quickly as possible. She gasped, as if those words had hit her chest like a punch. Divorce? Richard, don't throw away everything we've built. He turned to her, his eyes carrying the weight of months of lies and deception. You threw it away. I'm just finishing what you started. And then he left, without looking back, without giving her one more chance to talk, to beg, to try to fix what was already broken beyond repair. The next few days were a blur. He rented a small apartment while he sorted out the divorce issues, dividing his time between work and failed attempts to occupy his mind with anything other than Emily and her betrayal. But it was difficult. Everything reminded her. The places they used to frequent, the habits they created together, even the simple act of sleeping next to an empty pillow. But fate, always relentless, had one last blow to deal. Richard was leaving work when he received an unexpected call from a close friend. He answered, expecting a routine conversation, but the voice on the other end carried a tension that made his chest tighten. Richard. I didn't know how to tell you this, but I think you need to know. He frowned, stopping in the middle of the parking lot. What it was? There was a pause. Emily, she lost her job. For a moment, Richard felt only confusion. What? She was fired. I don't know all the details, but they say that her boss, the guy she was cheating on you with, was involved in a scandal. Fraud, embezzlement of company money, something big. And since she worked directly with him, well, they caught some compromising messages between the two of them. The company decided it was best to fire her too. Richard was silent, processing the words. And there's more, the friend continued. It looks like he's already with someone else. They said he was seen with a new employee a few nights ago. Emily, well, it looks like she's been dropped. The news hit him like a cold shock. He could feel satisfaction, revenge, any emotion that justified all the suffering he went through. But all he felt was emptiness. Emily had thrown away their marriage for an illusion. By a man who, in the end, used her and discarded her as if she were nothing. And now, she was alone, without a job, without her lover, without the life she tried to build on lies. Richard hung up the phone without answering and looked up at the sky, feeling an inexplicable weight dissipate from his chest. He realized, in that moment, that Emily was no longer his problem. Her suffering, her fall, her choices, all of it now belonged to her alone. He got in the car and drove home, knowing that, for the first time in months, he could finally breathe without carrying the weight of a love that was no longer there. The days that followed were silent for Richard, but not empty. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his life was no longer tied to Emily and the betrayal she had committed. There was a weight that I no longer carried, a pain that, although still present, was beginning to dissipate. He didn't feel angry. I didn't feel satisfaction. What was left now was just acceptance. The inevitable had happened, and he was there, in one piece, still standing. But fate, even when it seems to have come full circle, always finds ways to test a man. It was on a Saturday morning, when Richard was organizing his new home, that he heard the insistent ringing of his cell phone. He answered without even looking at the caller ID, expecting it to be something trivial, but the voice on the other end made him freeze. Emily. Her voice was weak, lifeless, filled with a restrained desperation that made his stomach turn. She hesitated before speaking his name, as if the mere mention of it was a painful reminder of what she had lost. He didn't respond immediately, he just waited. "I need to see you," her voice came out almost as a whisper, and Richard felt his chest tighten. "I don't think that's a good idea," he replied, without anger, without resentment. "Just the truth." "Please," she insisted, her voice broken, as if holding back tears. "I know I have no right to ask for anything. But I need to talk to you." There was a long silence before he sighed. Part of him wanted to say no, wanted to walk away for good, wanted to cut any remaining ties. But another part, a part he couldn't ignore, wanted to know. "I wanted to understand what was left of Emily after everything that happened." And so, against his instinct, he agreed. When he saw her, a few hours later, sitting in a cafe far from any shared memories, he realized that the woman in front of him was no longer the same. Emily seemed smaller, more fragile, as if the weight of the consequences had fallen on her with crushing force. The sparkle in the eyes he once loved was gone, replaced by an unsettling emptiness. She sat up slowly, her fingers shaking slightly as they held the cup of coffee that she didn't even try to drink. Richard didn't say anything. He just waited for her to speak. "I lost everything," she finally broke the silence, her voice barely audible. "The job, the reputation, the friendships that I thought were true. He used me, Richard. He made me believe that I meant something, that I was special, and the moment I no longer needed him, I was discarded as if I were nothing more than an insignificant detail in his life." Richard just nodded, not expressing surprise. He already knew. "I always knew it would be like this." "I'm not asking you for forgiveness," she continued, her breathing ragged. "I know that what I did is unforgivable. I betrayed you. I betrayed the man who loved me most in this world, I threw away the only true love I had for a ridiculous illusion. Richard took a deep breath, crossing his arms on the table. Then why did you call me here, Emily? She bit her lip, looking away at the street, as if searching for words. Because I don't know who I am without you. She closed her eyes tightly, as if saying that to herself as much as to him. And I wanted you to know that I regret it. With every part of my being, I regret it. He watched the woman before him, trying to find within himself any remnant of the person he once loved. But what was left now was just a distant echo. He no longer felt hatred, he no longer felt the desire for revenge. But I also didn't feel love. I hope one day you find a way to forgive yourself, he said, his voice calm but firm. But I'm not the person who can do that for you. Her eyes filled with tears, and Richard knew she finally understood. There was nothing left there to save. She nodded slowly, running her hands through her hair, looking more lost than ever. I just wanted you to know that I still love you. He sighed, feeling a different weight in his chest. But I don't love you anymore. And in that moment, he knew he was free. Emily lowered her head, allowing a few tears to fall onto her hands. But Richard didn't stay to see her cry. He stood up, looked at her one last time, and left, leaving behind not just a destroyed marriage, but a chapter of his life that was now finally closed. As he walked through the streets, he felt something he hadn't felt in months, peace. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start over. Richard left that cafe without looking back. The weight he carried for months seemed to be slowly dissipating. The conversation with Emily didn't make him happy or relieved, but it made him see something important: he no longer belonged in that story. The past was there, unalterable, unchanging, but it didn't need to continue defining your future. For the first time, he realized that he no longer needed to carry that burden. The following days were different. He returned to work with a new attitude, without the shadows of what he experienced weighing down his every step. Colleagues noticed the change. Not that he was completely healed, scars like those never disappear completely, but he no longer looked like someone who lived in endless pain. For the first time, he started going out more, going to new places, opening up space for conversations that he would have previously avoided. And so, on one of those nights, something unexpected happened. He was in a bar, a quiet place, far from any memories associated with the past. He was slowly drinking a drink, observing the movement around him, when a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Can I sit down?" He looked up and saw a woman with a discreet smile and curious eyes. Her hair fell over her shoulders in subtle waves, and her posture was relaxed, as if she were standing there with no intention other than enjoying the night. "Of course," he replied, surprised by himself. She pulled out the chair and sat down, watching him for a moment before laughing lightly. "You have the expression of someone who has been through a storm." He arched an eyebrow, picking up the glass and swirling the liquid inside it. "And you have the look of someone who has seen a lot of people like that." She nodded, an amused gleam in her eyes. "I work with people. I've learned to identify those who are trying to find a new beginning." Richard smiled for the first time in a long time. "And you think I'm one of those?" She tilted her head, as if evaluating the answer before speaking. "I think you're past the hard part. Now you just need to decide if you want to move forward or keep looking back." He didn't respond immediately. For the first time, the idea of moving on felt real. Possible. He no longer felt angry at Emily. "I felt no desire for revenge, nor sadness. What was left now was a man who had survived something devastating, but who still had a lot to live for." The minutes passed without haste, and the conversation between them flowed surprisingly well. Richard found himself recounting parts of his life he hadn't mentioned in ages, while hearing stories of hers that made him forget everything that came before. When the night ended, she got up, fixed her hair and faced him with a sincere smile. "It was nice talking to you, Richard." He was surprised to realize that he didn't want the night to end there. "Can I see you again?" She hesitated for a moment, but her look was not one of refusal, but of surprise. "I would love." And then, for the first time since everything happened, Richard felt something different. A glimmer of hope. The following days were filled with conversations that turned into meetings, meetings that turned into something more. It wasn't a rushed romance, it wasn't an escape, it wasn't a medicine for his wounds. It was something natural, built over time, with respect. He didn't expect to meet someone so soon, but he realized it wasn't about time. It was about being ready. Emily, on the other hand, took a different path. Repentance, although sincere, did not bring redemption. The betrayal not only destroyed her marriage, but also her reputation, her confidence in herself, the way she saw the world. She tried to rebuild her life, but the shadow of what she did followed her every step. The friends she believed she had disappeared, professional opportunities closed, and the future she thought she was building fell apart before her eyes. There was one night when she picked up the phone and dialed Richard's number. Her finger hovered over the call button, but at the last moment, she gave up. She knew he had moved on. And he knew he had no right to interfere in that. Richard never looked back. His new chapter was just beginning, and this time, he wouldn't let anything tie him to the past. Richard looked out at the city through his apartment window, the reflection of the city lights painting a new horizon before him. The past no longer weighed so much, and although the scars were still there, he no longer felt pain remembering them. Everything that had happened transformed him, but did not destroy him. In fact, he realized that he was stronger than he had ever been. Emily's betrayal, the disappointment, the humiliation, it all seemed like part of another life, one he no longer inhabited. His gift was different now. There was a quiet peace in his routine, something he hadn't felt in a long time. There were no more sleepless nights ruminating on words spoken, cold gestures or unexplained absences. Now, each day was his own, without the shadow of someone who didn't know how to value everything he had to offer. Emily, on the other hand, followed a completely different trajectory. Regret consumed her, corroded every decision she made. Time had not been kind to her. Ever since she lost her job and was rejected by the man she destroyed her marriage for, everything seemed to slowly fall apart around her. She tried to look for new opportunities, but her tarnished reputation preceded her in each interview. The corporate environment was small, people talked, and no one wanted to associate their name with the scandal in which they were involved. Not only did he lose his financial stability, but he also lost any trace of emotional security he once had. The pride that kept her from seeing what really mattered now became a bitter shadow of everything she had been. She tried to move on, tried to find comfort in new relationships, but nothing compared to what she had with Richard. There was a night when she, sitting on the sofa in the house they once shared, stared at her cell phone screen, breathing heavily. His number was still saved in her contacts, and his name was still a familiar echo that made her chest tighten. The urge to dial, to hear his voice one last time, to ask to see him, was almost irresistible. But she knew that even if he answered, nothing would change. He wouldn't come back. He had already overcome it, he had already moved on, and Emily was just a shadow of a past that he no longer wanted to carry. He dropped his cell phone on the table with a shaky sigh and hugged his knees, allowing the tears to fall in silence. Meanwhile, Richard walked alongside the woman he had recently met, a presence that, little by little, became an unexpected refuge. They were still in no rush, still discovering each other, but there was something there that he recognized, a beginning. One that was not based on pain or betrayal, but on choice. In freedom. He didn't want her to be a replacement for what he lost, because in truth, he hadn't lost anything. What he thought was love with Emily turned into an illusion, and now, he understood that true love doesn't suffocate, doesn't wear out, doesn't become a burden. It was light, it was simple, it was a mutual choice, not a desperate attempt to maintain something that was already dead. Time passed, and life took its course. Emily was forced to face all the consequences of her actions with no one to hold her back. She lost friends, lost opportunities, lost respect even for herself. He tried to rebuild himself, he tried to look for new ways to continue, but there was always that weight on his back. That certainty that he could have had everything, and destroyed it with his own hands. As for Richard, he never looked back. His future was an open, clean path, without shadows. A path that, for the first time, he walked without fear. Now it's your turn to tell us what you thought of this story. Comment your opinion below and share with us what impacted you most. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next shocking stories full of twists and turns. And remember, here, we do not support cheating in any way. Those who play with other people's feelings always pay the price. Until next time.